From the News Channel 5 Network, this is OpenLine.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to OpenLine. I'm Chris Davis, sitting in the chair for you tonight. We've got a topic that you may initially think doesn't apply to you, but I guarantee you, if you pay taxes in Tennessee, this applies to you, but especially if you have kids in public schools, if you have grandkids in public schools, if you know teachers, this is all very interesting. Our topic tonight is the basic education program in Tennessee, which is the funding apparatus for public schools, and how that might change with proposed legislation and a special session from the governor. Our guest tonight is Jennifer Hill. She is the Vice President of Policy and Programming for the Nashville Public Education Foundation. Jennifer, thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Chris, thanks for having me.
And so let's jump in by first kind of explaining what the BEP is, the Basic Education Program in Tennessee.
Absolutely. So the Basic Education Program is the mechanism by which the state funds public education. It's a formula that recognizes the types of resources and inputs that schools typically need to provide an education to public school students, and it generates funding based on those components. It's been around for about 30 years. It's a fairly complex formula. It has about 46 pieces that are used to calculate funding that flows to different school systems and counties. So it's a really interesting formula. And
I believe we have the maybe not necessarily popular distinction of being one of the more complicated formulas in the nation. Is that right?
Absolutely. It's one of the most complicated formulas in the nation. It's one of the hardest or least transparent to see in order to see how funding is actually impacting students.
Absolutely. So what are some of the proposed, I maybe jumped too early on that, maybe not proposed changes, but in your mind first, let's talk about maybe some of the problems with the formula. What are some things that you would like to see changed?
Yeah, so the formula that Tennessee has right now is what we call a resource-based formula. So it assigns a value to each of the 46 pieces that I just mentioned, and then calculates how those should be distributed across the state. So those kind of components don't really take into consideration the type of learners that we have in our schools. So that's one opportunity that I see from this session. I think the other thing that is complicated about our formula is that it actually uses best case scenarios, if you will, for what would happen in our classrooms to generate funding. And we know, living in a very complex world, that that's not oftentimes what actually occurs in our schools. And so there's a lot of opportunity and to talk about how we might go about doing that a little bit differently.
Absolutely. I think a lot of our viewers might be surprised when obviously public school teachers are state employees. It's, regulated in many ways at the state level, but the state does not provide all of the funding that most school districts need, right?
Correct. So the state, on average, tries to allocate about 55%, about 30% of the funding to local municipalities in the case of teacher salaries. But when it does that, the formula actually calculates the amount of salaries that a district might need based on ratios. And we know that, unfortunately, that students don't come in like 20 kid packages into each classroom. And so there are oftentimes, while the state might aspire to provide the vast majority of funding for teacher salaries, we know in practicality that actually doesn't happen.
Is part of the discrepancy the fact that the ratio is looked at it from a district level and not necessarily in an individual school level?
That's correct. Absolutely. And so a difference of even 2 to 3 students at a school could force an entirely different, could force the district or the school to add an additional classroom that was not calculated or through the formula that we use today.
Absolutely. So obviously this is not the first time that there's been an attempt to change the BEP. Other governors have done it, maybe made modest changes. Is there an indication that this may be more of a dramatic change, or what is the indication of what this may end up looking like?
There's been a lot of talk, and we really commend the governor and the commissioner for opening this conversation at this time about what it would look like to provide funding on a per student level based on student needs. And so the way some of other states do this is they have a specific student weight for what is considered the most typical learner, and they provide additional pockets of money or layers of money on top of that, depending on the individual learner's profile. So that could be whether or not they are receiving special education services, whether or not they're an English language learner, whether or not they are currently proficient in reading and math. Those type of characteristics may add funding to what would be considered a base amount.
And to be clear, that is not something that the state of Tennessee does right now. It doesn't factor in an individual student's needs in the overall formula?
No, it does not. It functions much more on kind of what a school needs to have in place and general ratios for services provided. So, for example, in the state of Tennessee, we fund school counselors 1 to 450, where the national best practice average would be closer to 1 to 250. So that could just right there provide 1 or 2 extra counselors to school communities to meet college counseling needs, to meet individual student transition needs, mental health needs, those type of things.
I'm curious from your perspective, Jennifer, you can tweak formulas in lots of different ways, but I imagine the amount of money that you're willing to put in the first place really is what can make a big difference in how it's all allocated. So is that something that you'd like the state lawmakers to look at as well?
We do. We think that we would like to see, or a great place to start would be to do the student-based funding formula, like what I just talked about. We do also need to look at the amount of money that the state is putting into K-12 education annually. So Tennessee ranks in the bottom 5 states for percent of GDP that is allocated to K-12 education, and we'd really like to see that increase. Right now, we're at 2.6% of GDP, where the national average is more around 3.4.
Absolutely. We've been talking about how, the way the current formula works, it just does not give enough resources to districts like Metro to be able to hire the number of teachers that they need. I'm curious, do you know offhand, how much, directly away from the formula is Metro having to spend each year to be able to meet their needs, even though on paper with the BEP, they're where they need to be?
Well, there's two things that factor into that decision. So, a Metro government is putting in a larger proportion of dollars than other counties, and that's because we're a relatively wealthy county. And so, when we think about the percentage that Nashville is putting in above and beyond, it's actually Metro government's contributing about 48% of the funding that goes into M&PS, where the state goal would be something more around 35%.
Absolutely. And I also have to imagine, and this may be a little bit tangential, but it crossed my mind, in the basic form, this formula is, like you said, 30 years old, but so much of education has changed. I know a lot of districts, partially because of the pandemic, have also moved to students being issued laptops, and that obviously, how much has education changed while this formula, for the most part, has stayed pretty much the same?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Chris. Not just only how much has education changed, but how much has the population of Tennessee changed during that time? And how can we best prepare our students for the jobs of the future that are coming and the opportunities that are coming into Tennessee right now?
Absolutely. I don't necessarily, and you can, well, let me start with this question. Do you have a basic understanding at this point of what the new formula may look like at this point?
I think so. I think those conversations are open. I think that there has been some desire to see what a student-based funding formula might look like in Tennessee. I think the commissioner and the governor mentioned that on Friday. I think that that this is an incredible opportunity for the public to get engaged and to share their opinions about what this might, what they would like this to look like, either based on their previous experiences, based on their children's experiences in schools right now. I'm sure most Tennesseans have an opinion on whether or not how well or how well not schools are currently resourced.
I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. There's no question that Governor Bill Lee, in his education initiatives since he's taken office, has focused a lot on vouchers in charter schools. Is there thought that those may factor into how a new formula is written as well?
I'm not 100% sure on that. I think it's a great question. I mean, from my perspective, we would want to see the public education dollars stay in public education to educate for the benefit of the million-plus students that are currently sitting in schools in Tennessee.
Absolutely. Well, Jennifer, we've gotten off to a great start. We'll have much more with her in just a minute. A reminder, if you have a question that you'd like to ask, that number's on your screen. We'll be right back after this.